Hello, welcome to Study with Kalindu. Thank you for visiting my YouTube channel. Today also we are going to discuss about an important topic. You can visit my website www.studywithkalindu.com to book me for private tutoring sessions. In addition, in my website you will be able to find a lot of study materials and blog articles as well. You can consult me for your thesis documents and research paper where I will be providing you with a fully fledged end-to-end support system to ensure that you get the maximum possible mark and grade for your dissertation. So let's get connected and let's study smart and let's win big. Thank you. Let's look at the WACC. Weighted average cost of capital. The name itself has two components, weighted average and cost of capital. First, to understand what weighted average cost of capital is, we need to have a very clear understanding as to what each of these components mean. So let's look at in detail at weighted average. Before understanding weighted average, we need to understand what simple average is. So let's take a look at a simple example of the simple average. Let's take a student who has faced 3 subjects, mathematics, commerce and music, in an exam, and out of 100 we've been given the marks that the student has obtained, 76, 80, 90. So the average is obtained by simply adding the 3 marks and dividing by the number of subjects. You add 76 to 80 to 90 and you divide by the number of subjects, which is 3, so you get the answer as 82. We can generalize this using a formula, sigma n goes from, or x goes from 0 to n, xk divided by n. Xk is the addition of all the marks and n is, in this case, the number of subjects. Now let's assume that each of these subjects have been given a credit attached to it. A credit tells how important the subject is. So for mathematics, this school has given a credit of 4 units or 4 credits. Commerce, you've been given 3 credits, and music, you've been given 1 credit. What this means is, whatever the markage that you have obtained for that particular subject will get multiplied by the number of credit to calculate a score for which you will be attributed a weighted average. So for mathematics, when you multiply the score by the credit, you get a total score of 304. And for commerce, when you multiply 80 by 3, you get 240. And similarly for music, you get 90. 90 multiplied by 1. So now you get a grand score of 634 by adding all the scores multiplied by their respective credit. And this is the fundamental of weighted average. You've been given a weight, a credit for every subject. You multiply it by the respective mark you have obtained for that particular subject. What you do is you add all those marks into the weight scores. So 304, 240 and 90, which is explained or denoted here. And then you add all those up, so 634, and divide by the number of credit, which is 4 plus 3 plus 1, 8. So 634 divided by 8, you will get a weighted average of 79.25. So you can generalize the weighted average formula, sigma x goes from 1 to n, or k goes from 1 to n. You multiply xk, wk. Xk is the markage, 76. Wk is the weight, 4. So you multiply these two, you get 304. Likewise, you do it for all the subjects and you add the whole thing, 634. That's why the sigma, and then you divide it by the number of credits, which is 8. 634 divided by 8, you get your weighted average 79.25. The important thing here to notice is, when you took the simple average, you had 82. But when you calculated the weighted average, you have 79.25. What this tells is, even though you have a high score for music, because the credit or the weight was only 1 for music, the impact music had on your weighted average is lower, but mathematics, for which the highest credit score was assigned, a 4, you have scored the lowest markage, and as a result, your average was dragged down to 79.25. So the weighted average, what you need to understand is, unlike in simple average, the weighted average will ensure that it will drag the weighted average closer to the markage or closer to the observation of the highest weighted unit or the highest weighted outcome in your study. Now let's look at cost of capital. So weighted average is already looked after. Now we are looking at cost of capital. Now the term cost of capital comes into light by the factors of production John Maynard Keynes explained in Keynesian economics. So you have 4 factors of production: land, labor, entrepreneurship and capital. Simple economics, right? So for each of these factors of production, there's a cost item as well. So we say cost of land, cost of labor, cost of entrepreneurship and cost of capital. So here's how the term comes into light. For cost of land you say rent, for cost of labor you say wages and salaries, cost of entrepreneurship is profit. Well, cost of capital, there's no special name, it's just the cost of capital, and this is how the name comes into light, cost of capital. But now for us to understand what cost of capital is, we need to firstly understand what capital is, for which we need to look at capital. Capital is nothing but monies an enterprise has to make capital expenditure. So the money you have, if you are a company, the money you have to make capital expenditure. So capital can mainly be in 2 forms, either equity or debt. So equity capital can be of 2 main forms: ordinary shares or preference shares. You know all these stuff already. Debt capital again can be of mainly 3 forms: bills and bonds, debentures, loans and leases. There are many other ways of debt capital, which we are not really going into detail in this unit because the focus is on actually calculating the cost of capital. So now capital, we learned, can be in 2 forms, equity and debt, and those also can be further segregated into their individual components. For all these capital items, there's a cost item as well. Now WACC is the weighted average of the cost of equity items and the cost of debt items. See, this is how you construct WACC. Now you know what the capital items are. If you can quantify the cost components of those capital items and take a weighted average, well then you will be obtaining the cost of capital of your company or the cost of capital for your project. Now let's look at the cost items of these capital components that we just discussed. So when we look at cost of capital, obviously, if capital is segregated into 2 components, equity and debt, the cost of capital will always be segregated into cost of equity and cost of debt. So cost of equity is nothing but the weighted average of cost of ordinary shares and cost of preference shares. Cost of debt capital is the weighted average of cost of bills and bonds, cost of debentures, cost of loans and leases, and all the other debt items you have. Therefore, we need to make some easements. So for the ease of understanding, we will consider the cost of ordinary shares and cost of preference shares as cost of equity and the cost of debt as a whole. This is just for our ease of understanding. Now let's look at cost of equity capital. We need to measure the cost of equity capital for us to be able to measure the cost of equity and for us to be able to thereby measure the cost of capital or the weighted average cost of capital as a whole. Now, cost of ordinary shares is denoted by KE. We can measure this using different mathematical and statistical models we have. One of those models are constant dividend model, we have dividend growth model, we have capital asset pricing model, we have Farmer-French 3-factor, 5-factor, APT arbitrage pricing theory, many ways to determine the cost of ordinary shares. Regarding all of these methods, I will be having a separate video so you can look at each of these methods in detail. I will not be discussing each of these methods, calculation methods in detail, but I will just be giving you the formula and explaining it a bit so that you know how to calculate the cost of equity using these different techniques. When we look at the constant dividend model, the cost of equity is calculated by just dividing the current dividend by the current share price. Now, what is the dividend paid out as a percentage or proportion of your current share price? The dividend paid in this case would be your cost of ordinary shares. That's very straightforward, right? Well, in the dividend growth model, you take the current dividend and apply the dividend growth rate. So, D naught into 1 plus G and divided by the current share price, right? So, next year dividend divided by the current share price. But since the dividend is on a growth trajectory, you add the growth rate as well. That gives you a cost of equity. In the capital asset pricing model, you have separate assumptions. You look at the entire stock market and you segregate the total risk the shareholders bear into diversifiable and non-diversifiable risk. And you define few terms: risk-free rate, beta factor, which talks about the sensitivity of the stock into entire market movements, and then RM is the market return and RF is the risk-free rate we just discussed. So the subtraction of RM and RF, RM minus RF, we call the risk premium with respect to the particular stock in consideration. So using these terms, we calculate the cost of equity using a security market line. These are separate theories which we will be discussing in a new video. But for the moment, just to calculate the cost of equity, you just add the beta into risk premium to your risk-free rate, which gives the cost of equity, rather the cost of ordinary shares. Farmer French 3-factor and 5-factor models have multiple beta factors, so multiple sensitivity factors for multiple separate variables you discuss. For example, in Farmer French 3-factor, you look at the risk premium multiplied by a beta factor. You look at the size effect of the stock multiplied by another beta factor, and you look at the value of the stock, whether it's a high valued or a low valued company, and you multiply it by the another beta factor, which gives you the cost of equity. However, even for this, the fundamental is established under the capital asset pricing model. Farmer French 5-factor gives you two other variables on top of Farmer French 3-factor. We call them the profit effect and the investing effect. Again, the fundamentals are established in the capital asset pricing model or the CAPM and Farmer French 3-factor models. So depending on the question you get and depending on the level that you are studying in, calculating the cost of ordinary shares can be done by using any of these models. However, I must tell you at this point, depending on the scenario, the effectiveness of using each of these models will differ. We will be looking at these things in detail when we are doing questions. Now, cost of preference shares, once again, it's very simple. You either use the constant dividend model and the dividend growth model. Generally, the cost of preference shares is found using these two methods, at least theoretical. So, theoretical calculations or academical calculations, we do not go into much detail in calculating cost of preference shares. We simply either use mostly the constant dividend model, sometimes we use the dividend growth model. Again, KP is the cost of preference shares. You have the formula here, you already have seen this. Growth model, once again, same all as the cost of ordinary shares. Now let's look at cost of debt capital. Well, cost of debt is denoted by KD. Cost of debt is the effective rate at which the company pays interest on its capital, such as on its debt capital, such as loans and bonds. So, what do you know? It's the effective rate at which the company pays interest on its debt capital. It is a rate that is used to discount all of its debt capital cash flows. This rate is given a special name called yield to maturity. So now you know cost of debt is nothing but yield to maturity. So if you know how to calculate yield to maturity, then you have the cost of debt at hand. But let's be patient and go one by one. So I will crack the code to calculate the cost of debt. Now let's take a company. Company A has total debt of 200 million. It pays a total interest of 10 million. Very simple. Your cost of debt is 10, which is the total interest, divided by 200. You get 5%. It's a very simple example. Deriving cost of debt is complicated than this. Now why is it complicated? Well, we have to look at patiently. Okay, this is why it gets complicated. Your interest is tax deductible. See, I have seen students who just memorize interest is tax deductible and they just take the effective cost of debt using the gross cost of debt, which I believe is not the proper way of doing it. You need to understand, we are talking about a debt capital, we are talking about a yield to maturity and effective cost of debt, and at the same time we are talking about interest is tax deductible. So how this whole thing happens, you need to have a snapshot in your mind so that you will be doing your calculations with proper understanding. Now let's look at an example to really understand this whole tax deductible story. We have the company which is having 200 million debt capital and a pre-tax cost of debt of 5%. Now how this 5% happened? Because you paid an interest of 10 million, which we just looked at. 10 divided by 200 is your 5%. And now we've been given that the tax rate is 25%. Let's understand this tax deductible story. First, let's recall what cost of debt is. And let's put in some numbers. Let's assume that this company has earnings before interest and tax, which is the EBIT of 250 million, and you know the interest expense, we assumed it to be 10 million, so you have the earnings before tax of 240 million. But the point is, this earnings before tax figure is not supportive enough for us to calculate the tax expense. Have you ever heard of accounting profit and the taxable profit? Well, you arrive at the taxable profit from the accounting profit by taking some guidelines issued by the tax authority. The tax authority says you can't calculate the tax based on the accounting profit before tax. However, you have to calculate the tax profit. How the tax profit is calculated? Well, tax authority says these are the allowable expenses which you can deduct from the pre-tax profit, accounting profit, but there are some disallowable expenses which you will have to add onto the pre-tax accounting profit. That net figure will be the taxable profit. So you can always show it as a formula. You take the accounting profit, deduct the allowable expenses, add the disallowable expenses, you have the taxable profit at hand. Onto this taxable profit, you apply the tax rate and calculate the tax the company needs to pay. Interest is an allowable expense. This is where the tax deductible story happens. So what happens when you take an allowable expense? You are allowed by the tax authority to deduct the portion of that allowable expense, the portion that is attributable to the tax from the original expense, so you will have a net expense. Let me explain this further. So you had an interest expense of 10 million. The tax authority tells you interest is an allowable expense. So what you do, you apply the tax rate, which is the 25% in this case, onto the interest amount of 10 million. So 10 into 25% is 2.5. You deduct 2.5 million from 10 million to get a net figure of 7.5 million. So this is the net interest you need to pay, or you will be paying. And you divide that 7.5, the net interest, by the total debt 200 million, you get a figure of 3.75. This 3.75 is the post-tax cost of debt, or the cost of debt net of taxes. So you initially had a 5% cost of debt. You apply 1 minus 25%. Why minus 25%? The portion attributable to the taxes. As a result, you get 3.75%. That is 5 into 1 minus 25%. That is 0.75 or 75%. So 5% into 75%, you get 3.75%, which is the net cost of debt. Let's put some numbers and really understand how this 3.75 happens, and let's generalize it. So you had a pre-tax profit, accounting profit of 240 million, which is shown here, and then we put some numbers. Interest is an allowable expense, 10 million. You deduct that from your pre-tax accounting profit, and other allowable expenses, let's assume to be 50 million, and you add disallowable expenses, we'll assume them to be 20 million. So you get a taxable profit of 200 million. How? 240 minus 10 is 230. You minus another 50, 180, plus 20 is 200. So now tax at 25% on this 200 million would be 50 million. This is the tax calculation. Now what happens to the interest? You paid a gross interest of 10. Deduction for taxes 2.5. Why? 10 into 25%. The tax component, or the percentage, or the component that's attributable to taxes. So the effective interest is 7.5 million. Interest percentage is 3.75. Why? You divide 7.5 by the original total debt 200. 7.5 divided by 200 is 3.75. But what happens when you take this bit, KD into 1 minus T? You had a KD of 5%, cost of debt of KD of 10%, cost of debt of 5% rather, cost of debt of 5%, because you paid an interest of 10 million on a total debt of 200 million. So KD is 5% into 1 minus T, 1 minus tax rate. So 5% into 0.75%, you get 3.75%. So you don't just take the cost of debt as is into the weighted average cost of capital calculation. You take the cost of debt into 1 minus your tax rate. So this is how the interest become tax deductible. This is how interest become tax deductible. Do not memorize it, but understand it and have a snapshot in your mind, so you will never ever get any calculation incorrect. Now let's recall the weighted average example that we did at the very beginning of this video. Remember, we had three subjects: mathematics, commerce and music, and we had credits assigned to each of those subjects. Using these credits, we can calculate individual credit percentages to have an alternative method of calculating the weighted average. Individual weight is nothing but the individual's credit score divided by the total credit score. For mathematics, for example, you had an individual credit score of 4. You divide it by the total credit score of 8. So the weight, or the individual weight for mathematics, is 50%. For commerce, it's 3 divided by 8, it's 37.5%. For music, it's 1 divided by 8, which is 12.5%. Now, when you add 50 and 37.5 and 12.5, you get 100%, which is 1. So, always the addition of all weights will be equal to 100% to 1. Using these individual weights and individual marks, you can calculate the weighted average. Rather than multiplying your mark by the number of credits and adding all those and then dividing by the total credit to get the weighted average, now we can use individual marks and individual weight percentage. So you take 76 for mathematics, for example, and multiply it by 50%. You take 80 for commerce and multiply it by 37.5%, and you take 90 for music and multiply it by 12.5%. When you do this, you get 79.25, which was our weighted average at the start of this video. So this is a eureka moment. Why? Now you have an easier way, an easier formula of calculating the weighted average cost of capital. You take individual observations, multiply them by individual weights, you get your weighted average at once. Using all this understanding, we can apply them to derive the back formula. Weighted average cost of capital is nothing but the weighted average of the costs of your capital components. Let's denote the total capital as capital T. So capital T is the addition of the value of equity, which is ordinary shares and preference shares. So we say VE and VP as value of ordinary shares and value of preference shares, and VD is value of debt. So we denote ordinary shares by E, preference shares by simple T, and debt by D. So T equals VE plus VT plus VD. So ordinary shares, we assign the value to be VE, the cost to be KE. Therefore, the weight is your VE divided by T. The weight of ordinary shares would be the value of ordinary shares divided by the company's total capital. So VE divided by T is your WE. WE is the weight of ordinary shares. Similarly, you can have the notations for preference shares VP, KP and WP, and for debt VD, KD and WD. Using these notations, we can construct the weighted average cost of capital formula. Your weighted average cost of capital therefore is your WE into KE. WE is the weight of equity, KE is the cost of equity. Your WP is the weight of preference shares, KP is the cost of preference shares. Your WD is the weight of debt, KD is the cost of debt. However, it's not just KD that you put into the weighted average cost of capital formula. You multiply the KD by 1 minus tax rate, because interest is tax deductible. This is how we bring in the learning and the example that we just looked at with respect to interest being tax deductible into the weighted average cost of capital formula. So as a result, we have the WACC to be WEKE plus WPKP plus WDKD into 1 minus T. Question time. We just covered all the fundamentals behind weighted average cost of capital. Now let's apply them to see how far we have gotten from the start of this video. Consider a company with a capital structure provided below. Ordinary shares, you have a value and they have already given you the cost of ordinary shares. How generous. You have preference shares, value and costs are given. You have bonds, value and costs are given. So the total capital is also calculated, nothing but VE plus VP plus VD. So this is your total capital or total value of the company. Find the company's WACC if the corporate tax rate is 27%. Tax rate is also given. Why? Because 1 minus T comes into play. Now, for you to calculate the weighted average cost of capital for this company, you need to have 7 components with you. You need to have WE, KE, WP, KP, WD, KD and T. The first thing of solving this question is to understand what are already given and what are the things that you need to find. If you really look at it, cost items are already given. So KE you already have, KP you already have, KD you already have, T is given. So out of the 7 components that are in the WACC formula, you are being given 4 components already in the question. So directly you've been given. What you do not have is WE, WP and WD. Weight of ordinary shares, weight of preference shares and weight of debt. How to calculate the individual weights? Well, you already know. You take the individual item component and you divide it by the total. Remember, WE was nothing but VE divided by T. So let's look at how you solve this. Let's start with the known parameters. The dotted parameters are already known. KE, KP, KD and T are given. We have to calculate the weights of individual capital items. So ordinary shares, the weight would be 7.528426 divided by 12.379042. VE is 7.5 million. T is 12.3 million. You divide this 7.528426 million by 12.379046 million. That gives you the weight for ordinary shares to be 60.82. Similarly, you can divide 1,256,444 by 12.3 million, which will give you 10.15% as the weight of preference shares. The weight of bonds would be 3,594,172 divided by 12,379,042, which gives you 29.03%. When you add 60.8 to 10.15 and 29.03, you get a total weight of 100% O1, which was what we stated previously. Weight is nothing but the individual capital divided by total capital. That's how you already derived the individual weights. Now it's just a matter of identifying the fact that you have WV, WP and WD also with you in here. So it's just a matter of substituting them into this formula. So let's solve. WACC is nothing but WVKE plus WPKP plus WDKD into 1 minus T. You put in the WV, which is 60.28%, the KE, cost of ordinary shares, 8.75% already given, WP is 10.15%, which you already calculated, and the cost of preference shares was given 8%, and you calculated the weight of debt or weight of bond 29.03%, and the cost of debt was given as a pre-tax cost of debt 6.9%. But now you have to apply the 1 minus T, which is 1 minus the tax rate was 27%. So 6.9% into 1 minus 27%, you get a WACC of 7.6%, which is again an eureka moment. See how easy it is. When you have the fundamentals under control, you can just apply them into your formula and derive the weighted average cost of capital. Summary. Cost of capital refers to the cost an enterprise has to bear in fueling capital into it. There are two major components of capital, equity and debt. Cost of equity can be found by dividend models or market return models. Cost of debt is the effective rate at which the company pays interest on its debt. This is equal to the yield to maturity. WACC is obtained by determining the weight of each equity component and debt component and then multiplying them with respective costs of capital. Remember, individual weights by individual cost of capital. As interest is tax deductible, the effective interest rate is interest into 1 minus tax rate is always considered in the WACC formula. What's next? Basic and intermediate calculations of WACC. This means in my channel, I will be bringing you an exclusive video entirely comprised of basic to intermediate calculations in WACC. So guys, stay tuned, look at this video, learn the fundamentals, come to the next video, we'll do plenty of calculations. Thank you very much, and do subscribe to this channel and press the bell icon to get instantly notified when a new video is uploaded. Visit my website www.studywithkalindu.com to make bookings for private tutoring sessions with myself. Thank you very much. Study hard and all the best.